10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 101. Hey everybody, and welcome back to episode 101 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. My name is Nick Manella. How's it going? Hope you had a great week and hope you're ready for a brand new episode. Some new stuff to learn this week. Remember, you can get all the PDFs to these episodes at our Patreon site. That's patreon.com/10minutejazzlesson. Or you can head over to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, and you can click on one of the Patreon links. Remember, we are adding all kinds of benefits for members all the time. Our newest thing for our Patreon members, our beloved Patreon members, of which we have almost 100 out there. We saw a huge influx last week, so thank you so much to the people that signed up recently. We really appreciate it. You're helping to keep the podcast going and always having new stuff coming out for you to give you more value in your life as a musician. So remember, on April 22nd, Sunday, April 22nd, we are going to do an online masterclass via Google Hangouts. And if you can't make it on the afternoon of the 22nd, don't worry about it. We're going to record it, and it will be posted in Patreon for everybody to see. And this is going to be the newest thing. We are going to do a monthly online masterclass where we can go a little bit deeper into topics than we can in 10 minutes on the podcast. And my ultimate goal, once we have enough supporters on Patreon to make this a reality, is to bring in other artists and have them teach masterclasses for you. So if you were on the fence about becoming a Patreon member, now is the time, where there's really a lot of benefits stacking up for you over there. And it's only $3 a month, so you really can't go wrong at that price. All right, so let's jump into today's episode. Today we're going to do a little bit of a theory lesson. I feel like this is going to be a very important episode for people without a traditional music theory background. We're going to talk about something that is really essential to understanding chord progressions and memorizing tunes and things of that nature, and that's the concept of secondary dominance. So the first thing we need to talk about is what is a dominant. I'm sure when I say the word dominant, a lot of you, what comes to mind is a dominant chord. So, a major chord with a flatted seventh on top. And that is true. That is called a dominant seventh chord. But we're going to be talking about a little bit of a different avenue of the term dominant this week. So I wanted to clarify that before we jump into it. When I say dominant, what I'm talking about is a 5-to-1 cadence, right? So a dominant chord, a 5 chord, to a 1 chord. And this is something that really shows itself to us in jazz. A lot of the traditional jazz progressions contain a lot of dominance, a lot of 5-to-1. That's really, Western harmony is really based on that 5-to-1 cadence. Of course, there are other cadences out there, but this is the most common and by far the most important is that 5-to-1 relationship. So if you were to look at the blues, if you were to look at a 3-6-2-5-1 progression, which is present in so many jazz tunes, if you were to look at variations of the 2-5-1 progression, it's really important to know what a secondary dominant is. So now we need to talk about what it is, what it actually is. So a secondary dominant would be when a tune temporarily moves to a different key by way of a dominant chord. We have what's called a secondary dominant. The primary dominant is going to be the 5 chord in whatever key the tune is. So we are playing is in. Sorry, I got a little tongue-tied there. So let's say that we're in the key of C. The primary dominant is going to be a G chord, right? Because that's the 5 of C. So we'll see a G chord move to a C chord, and that's going to be our primary dominant to tonic root movement that provides us with that 5-to-1 cadence. Now, Most jazz tunes, they don't just stay in one key. They actually move around to several different keys within the course of the tune. So now, in order to move into a new key, what we really want to do is what's called tonicize that key, right? We want to make some kind of preparation to move ourselves into that new key. So let's take the blues, for example. And let's take a simple example. In the fifth bar of the blues, it moves to the key of the 4, right? So temporarily, we're moving to the key of the 4, and then we're coming back to the key of the 1 a couple of measures later. So we're going to start with the blues and talk about these secondary dominants. So let's look at the first 4 measures of the blues. What we have is a 1 chord in bar 1, followed by a 4 chord. Now that doesn't have any kind of preparation for it. It just straight up moves to the 4 chord very, very temporarily. Then it comes back to a 1 chord in measure 3. Now, in measure 4, here's where on the surface it just looks like another measure of the 1 chord. But what this chord is really functioning as is a secondary dominant of the 4 chord. So we know that in measure 5, we're going to move to the key of the 4 for 2 measures. So if you think about it, if we're in the key of B flat blues, and this is where your PDF worksheet will come in really handy, I've marked where all the secondary dominants are. So in measure 4 of the blues, the 1 chord is actually functioning as a 5 of 4. So think about that for a second. A B flat chord is the 5 chord when we're in the key of E flat. And that's in fact what we're doing in measure 5 is we're moving to the key of E flat. So now that's not just a simple 1 chord, that is the 5 of 4. And that's what a secondary dominant is, right? It's the 5 of another key. Now that opens up a whole world of possibilities for us, including a lot of the tensions we can use over a 5 chord. Once we realize that it truly is a 5 chord of another key, that opens us up to a lot of other possibilities. We're going to talk about that in future episodes. But right now, let's look where there are other secondary dominants in the blues. So the second one comes in bar 9. Now typically, we would call this a 6 chord, right? So if we're in the key of B flat blues, a lot of the time what we do is we play a G7 in bar 8 that will shift us into bar 9 with a little bit more gravity. And that's really what secondary dominants are all about, is giving us a little bit more harmonic motion that will push us towards the next chord, therefore giving us a little bit more interesting voice leading and stuff like that. But let's talk about this. If we talk about it as a 6 chord, that doesn't really work. So if you think about the chord tones in a G7 chord, we have G, B, D, and F. There's one note that actually doesn't fit into the key of B flat, and that's the B natural that's contained in that G7 chord. So this really isn't a 6 chord because it doesn't really fit in the key of B flat. So what this is a secondary dominant of C minor 7. So if you look at bar 9, we have a C minor 7 chord. What the G7 chord is a 5 of 2. So what it's doing is it's providing us with a little bit more motion into the 2 chord, giving us that secondary dominant of 2. So if you've never really thought about where that 6 chord actually comes from, this might be a brand new thing for you. So there's our other secondary dominant, the 5 of 2 in bar 8. And then if you want to play the blues progression in a real kind of bebop way, which might be a little bit advanced for some of you, but I think some of you are probably getting to the point, if you've studied my 60 Days to Crushing the Blues course, this is all contained in there with some exercises and stuff to really get you going on some of these new changes for you. So in the last 2 bars of the blues, a lot of people will do what's called a turnaround. So instead of just playing the 1 chord in bar 11 and then maybe playing a simple 5 chord to get you back to the top of the blues, what a lot of people do is they'll play 1, 6, 2, 5 in bars 11 and 12. Now, again, I said 1, 6, 2, 5, but if we were being really theoretically correct, which sometimes we want to do to help ourselves understand what's going on in a tune, What we would really say is 1, 5 of 2, 2, 5, 1. So what we're doing is we're temporarily tonicizing that 2 chord. We're making that the 1 chord for a split second and then turning it into the 2 chord and starting our cadence over again. Now, I hope this makes sense to all of you out there. I'm trying to really explain it in a easy to understand fashion, but if you have questions, definitely let me know. But going back to that turnaround, B flat 7 to G7 to C minor 7 to F7. A lot of people would just say 1, 6, 2, 5, which is a quick shorthand way of really saying 1, 5 of 2, 2, 5, 1. So hopefully that makes sense. Now what I'm going to do is actually play the B flat blues progression with all of these secondary dominants in there. And I want you to really hear how the secondary dominant in bar 4, bar 8, and then the turnaround in bars 11 and 12 are really tonicizing where we're going temporarily before we move to the more traditional 2-5-1 progression. So check out how this sounds and make sure that you're looking along on your PDF because that's really going to illustrate where all of this stuff actually happens. All right, so hopefully you could hear, especially in bar 8, I really truly think that that's the most important secondary dominant in the entire blues progression. The one in bar 4 is pretty hard to hear because you have to sort of make that leap in your understanding of the progression to actually hear that as a 5 chord. But again, we're going to go into what you can actually do over bar 4 in future episodes. So you'll be able to hear it a lot better once you understand some of the tensions that you can use there. And we're going to be talking about blues subs and things like that. But, you know, that one in bar 8, and again, the turnaround at the end, what I'm really hoping you can get out of this episode is actually hear how those addition of those chords really make it more interesting. So using secondary dominants as a means to give us more complicated and therefore more interesting voice leading and understanding how to actually play over those, which will come in the future, right? We want to just start with a solid understanding of this. So I know that I'm not giving you anything like, you know, super hip to work on this week, but it really truly is important that we understand how this music works sometimes. And sometimes we have to step outside of learning licks and tricks and things like that and actually get down to the meat of what makes chord progressions function and what these chords actually are, and be really technical about it and really drill down on the stuff. So that's what this week and next week are all about. Next week, what I'm going to show you is how a 3-6-2-5-1 progression functions with the secondary dominants. And then I'm also going to talk about a variation on the 2-5-1 progression that we see a lot that's actually 5 of 5, 5-1. So we're going to delve a little bit deeper into that next week. So make sure you tune in for the part 2 on this. And then we're going to jump into, okay, now that we have this theoretical knowledge, how do we now apply it to our playing? So that's going to be like about the next 3 or 4 episodes of the podcast. We're really going to, you know, start from this point and then turn it into some really hip stuff that you can do once you understand how the secondary dominants function and how we can use them. All right? Make sure you shoot me any questions that you have. I'm always here, 10minutejazzlesson@gmail.com. Make sure you hop on over to Patreon, sign up, get in for that 422 masterclass. We're coming up with a topic for it right now, and we will announce that on future episodes. All right, have a great weekend, and we will see you next week. Bye.